I'm a neuroscientist by background. I've been doing clinical research for about 12 years or so, mostly on the neuroscience of mental disorders like schizophrenia and depression, and also about research into treatments as well, and the neuroscience behind treatments. And so I want to try to keep my presentation to a minimum. I don't really want to talk too long. I just want to briefly introduce a few ideas from the world of psychology and neuroscience that could help provide some explanations for some of the abnormal exhaustion and stress that we might be experiencing at the moment. And understanding why we're actually experiencing certain thoughts and emotions is really the first step to working towards improving our own mental health. So I hope by giving you a few kind of insights that I could also lead you on to thinking about possible ways that you could help to kind of address or improve your mental well-being that might be related to your digital consumption. And I was hoping that we can maybe just keep questions to the end. But I'm very open. I was hoping that we could kind of open up the questions to not necessarily just talk about digital well-being, but I hope this could be an opportunity for anyone who's really interested in the brain and mental health, or in neuroscience and mental health in general, that they could feel free to ask any questions. I'm very open to at least give a try to answering the questions. I can't guarantee that maybe I'll give a good answer, but yeah, I could do my best at least. Okay, so I'll just jump straight in. So I wanted to first talk about Zoom, and I think we've all at least heard of, or most likely experiencing Zoom fatigue. But the question is, well, why is it that doing video calls is so exhausting? And one of the reasons, if you think in psychological terms, we could really compare it to being like kind of on a stage. Like we're often faced with multiple people on screen, like now, who are kind of like your audience, and there's this pressure to really perform when you're in a video call like this. And introverts like me, this can be really, really tiring if you're doing this multiple times a day, every day of your working week. And yeah, this performance can really take a lot of energy. And also just in terms of the information that we receive from doing video calls, like you're only really seeing this part of my body, and like right now I have a blank wall behind me, and there's not really much context to the conversation that we're having or the discussion. Where in the real world, you would see my whole body, there'd be a lot more body language involved. We would be in a different environment that would have a whole bunch of cues that could help us kind of help us in our understanding of the other person and understanding people in a certain interaction. And we've lost all of that essentially when we're doing video calls. So we might even tend to kind of just try to express our emotions more vividly, or just even exaggerate our emotions to try to get our message across, because we know that we're missing all this information. And especially with internet connection sometimes dropping, which tends to happen to me a lot, which is really frustrating. And even if it can be for a split second, this can really just also add to this reduction of the information that we're receiving. And there's even studies showing that neuroscientific studies, where if you look at the brain activity under circumstances of uncertainty or ambiguity, we know that this can be really costly for your brain and use up a lot of energy in your brain. And there's even one study that found that if you have even short delays in a video call or a phone call, then that tends to lead people to create a kind of negative view of the person that they're communicating with, and even seeing them as being less friendly or less focused. And also just being on video calls all day, that really just reminds us of the abnormality of the situation, that reminds us of the pandemic that we're in right now. And this can easily bring up a lot of associations that we have coded in our memories, negative associations that can lead us onto feelings of worry and anxiety and stress related to the pandemic. So yeah, and what just the act of working from home more often is something that a lot of us are not really used to, and we're not really prepared for either. And this could really be taking more of a toll on our mental health than we really think. There's a theory in psychology, it's called the self-complexity theory. And what this theory says is that each person's cognitive representation of themselves is made up by different facets, or different dimensions, or different roles even. So you kind of, the way you build the model of yourself, you see yourself as as an employee, and you go to work and you associate being an employee with your office. Even the bus ride to work, you could associate with that. And then when you're at home, you have environmental cues of your dining table and your kitchen to remind you that you're back with your family, and now you're in the role of being a family member, a partner, or a parent. And according to this theory, it's this complexity in terms of our representation of ourselves is actually related to how extreme our mood swings are. And so people who tend to have a less kind of complex view of themselves, or a fewer number of kind of facets or identities or roles, they tend to experience more negative emotions, and they tend to be less able to actually regulate their emotions. And having a more complex life, like having more, like for example, a broader social network where maybe your complexity, your self-complexity might be reflected within your social network. That can also act as a buffer against stressful life events. And so in this pandemic, we're stuck at home, all these environmental cues that we typically have, like going to work on the bus, seeing our work colleagues, going to the coffee machine at work, all of these cues have been stripped away. And so these lines and these boundaries between our different selves have become completely blurred. And so this complexity has been reduced suddenly, without any preparation. And so this kind of fits with this idea of this theory that this reduction in our self-complexity can actually lead to us not being able to regulate our emotions as well, and even lead us to feeling more stress. So one way to counteract that could be, I'm sure many of you have already read tips on how to really feel good about working from home, things like putting on your work clothes in the morning, maybe taking a walk around the block every morning like you're on your way to work, making sure you're having strict working hours, and making family time, really family time. And yeah, things like that, really thinking about these boundaries could help counteract that. And yeah, another big issue that comes up from working from home is procrastination. And there's been many psychological studies on procrastination, and kind of counterintuitively, many of the studies and theories show that procrastination actually can serve to help regulate our moods, and can even provide some kind of short-term repair to our emotions. If we're feeling bad about a particular upcoming event, like for example, for me being an introvert, I find it very exhausting to give public presentations. And so in preparation for this webinar, for example, maybe I would have avoided that negative emotional association by procrastinating. So in fact, it's not really caused by boredom or laziness, as we might tell ourselves sometimes. And it could even have some possible benefits to us. And I think just having that information alone I find that really helpful, to think about it in a more positive way and not beat yourself up about procrastinating or not to feel guilty about it, and to realize that there's actually that procrastination really does serve some purpose. And many of the negative consequences of procrastination, or the negative feelings that we have associated, are related to us thinking about our future selves, us feeling bad about our work plans, the fact that maybe we could have done more in a day if we didn't procrastinate, and we could be a better person. And there's this cognitive dissonance between our current selves and our future selves. And a lot of that is related to a particular brain area called the prefrontal cortex, where we kind of create this simulation of future events of ourselves that we might be dreading. And this simulation can then lead us down to the road of procrastination. And so one way to counter that could be to actually schedule in procrastination into your day, or have a planned or active procrastination. And so you could think about, kind of reflect on, okay, well, what do I really do when I procrastinate during the day? What do I enjoy doing? What makes me feel good during my procrastination time? And then when you're planning your daily schedule, you could actually fit a time slot in where you could say, okay, now I'm actually going to do some procrastination. And yeah, that could really help you take away the guilt, I guess. But essentially, really to overcome chronic procrastination, it needs to be treated like any other habit. And yeah, so with procrastination at home, this often leads to information overload, especially in this time during this pandemic, where we're looking at the news a lot more than we usually do. And so there's even studies showing that the people who are exposed to a lot of media around a traumatic event, they can even experience more stress than the people who were actually directly involved in the traumatic event. And there's also there's a well-known psychological bias known as the negativity bias. And this is the tendency to pay attention to negative stimuli or negative events going on in our environment. And this actually has some evolutionary benefit to us. For our ancestors, paying attention to like a saber-toothed tiger running towards us is beneficial for our survival. But in our modern world, we're not faced with these kinds of risks anymore. So we tend to maybe pay attention to things like car crashes, terrorist attacks. And this part of this negativity bias is that we would tend to overreact to negative information relative to the positive information. And this is related to the part of the brain called the amygdala, which is related a lot to emotions and these extreme reactions to very highly salient stimuli. And this is taken advantage of in the media a lot to kind of sensationalize stories. And so it's no wonder that, when you start to spend more time reading the news, that you tend to get drawn into more to these negative type of thinking. And one way to deal with that is to think about consuming information in a more intentional way, and really being selective, and maybe going on something like a bad news diet, where you might choose to actively focus more on positive stories in the news, or even look for channels which only show positive news stories. In the list of resources that I wanted to distribute afterwards, I've got a recommendation of some nice channels where you can look for positive news. And another big topic that's being talked about in the current pandemic is loneliness, which a lot of us are experiencing. And us as human beings, if you look at neuroscience or psychology or any study looking at human behavior, we know that we are a social species. When we look at the brain development of our early ancestors, the most striking difference is the growth of our prefrontal cortex, which largely makes up the social part of the brain. And there's even a field of neuroscience which is dedicated to this study of social interaction, which is social neuroscience. And to kind of simplify the field, a lot of the research that's done in the field, we now know, looking at brain, I guess this is kind of intuitive, but even when we look at brain activity, we see that the way that we perceive ourselves is very much dependent on how we see others. And so if we're stuck at home right now, we're lacking a lot of the social feedback that we typically get. And so it's no wonder that we might start to feel uncertain about our sense of self. This could lead to us questioning our own identities, our own place in the world. And over time, this could even have a negative impact on our self-esteem. And yeah, there's some interesting studies in neuroscience, brain imaging studies, where they found that actually when you give to other people, or if you're charitable, this can actually stimulate the pleasure centers in the brain in the same ways. You see similar brain activity patterns coming up as you would when you actually receive some rewards. And so in terms of loneliness, another issue is really the lack of affectionate touch. And this is especially for people living alone, having this long period of kind of touch deprivation. It could be having a big impact on our emotions, on our brain function. There was a famous study, I think in the 90s, done on a large group of orphans in Romania. And these orphan babies were neglected, and they had a lack of affectionate touch. These babies were later followed up, and brain imaging studies were done with these babies, and the studies found that their brains were actually smaller than the average baby, showing that affectionate touch can actually have really impactful effects on our brain development even. And a lot of the work that I've been doing focuses around this a hormone called oxytocin, which is a hormone that is released when we receive affectionate touch. It's been called the hugging hormone before, and it not only makes us feel good, but it can also buffer against stress as it interacts with the release of cortisol, the stress hormone in our body. So yeah, that's really all of the theory that I wanted to cover. And just to summarize, I wanted to just go over some of the tips that you could take home from all of this information, from our understanding of the brain and from our understanding of the psychology that might be behind our mental health, that might be related to digital consumption during the current pandemic. So one tip could be to try to really cut down on video calls, and if you can, even switch to phone, just a regular audio phone call, because then that immediately takes away a lot of the issues that you would have in terms of the performance stress, this ambiguity, and all these issues that are related to video calls. And scheduling breaks between Zooming can be really beneficial as well. And being really strict with that, even if you have a busy day, it's easy, I think, to just take on back-to-back Zoom calls, and then your whole day is pretty much done. And then you don't even realize how exhausted you are until it gets to the end of the day. And having that day in and day out over a long period of time, that can really have detrimental effects on our mental health. So in terms of our different selves and this idea of our self-complexity, you could think about finding ways to maintain your different selves or your different roles, and to kind of try to make these boundaries between our different selves less blurred. Like things I've already mentioned, like putting on your work clothes, and having strict work hours, and I also mentioned about planned procrastination, including that into your daily schedule. It could be another tip. And related to that would be being more intentional about the consumption of information. Think about where the information is coming from. Is it a reliable source? Just being critical when you're consuming information is already a huge step in thinking about how much that can have an effect on your emotions, on your mood. And in terms of social interaction, just finding time to connect as much as possible. Not only connecting with people, friends and family directly, but just also this idea about empathy and compassion and being charitable. From neuroscience, we know that this is rewarding and pleasurable for us in the same way that we get pleasure from regular social interactions. So just even thinking about the greater good, remembering our common humanity, and thinking about compassion for the world. I think even those thoughts alone, could be beneficial for ourselves. And being kind to ourselves, and being compassionate and forgiving to yourself, I think is really something that I'm still learning to do. And I often have to remind myself to not be so hard on myself, and that it's okay to, let things slide sometimes. And also remembering that being kind to others also can improve your own mental health. So maybe think about, people in your community, your neighbor, if there's ways that you can help them, that can also benefit you directly. So yeah, that's about it really. So I wanted to now kind of open up questions to see if anyone had anything about any questions about anything that I said, but also just please feel free to ask anything about the brain or the brain and mental health. I would be more than happy to at least try to answer. Yeah, so I don't know if...
Yeah, in the chat we don't have any questions yet, but use the time now. I will have one question so people can write while I'm talking, maybe. I'm wondering about digital addiction, like lots of people, I think including myself, quite addicted to social media. Can you share anything about this, like how to prevent it or how to work on it?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's because it's a relatively new thing that we're thinking about. There might be a tendency to think that this is something distinct. This is different from any other type of addiction, but actually a lot of the research shows that a lot of the psychological features that people have or associated with like social media addiction, and gaming addiction is actually, there's been a lot of studies done with gaming addiction, And essentially the way that they are dealt with is the same as any other addiction, drug addiction, alcohol. And I think a lot of the same principles can be applied. So it's the idea of an addiction is essentially a habit kind of getting out of control. So one way to deal with that could be thinking about looking into ideas for how to break habits. I was also thinking of actually adding a few resources on the list about some evidence-based ways for dealing with habits that are based on science, backed by psychological theory, backed by studies. And yeah, there's a lot out there, but there's also a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of kind of pseudoscience out there. So it's really difficult, I think, to filter things out and find what is good and what is helpful. But yeah, I hope that answered your question.
I would have a question. I mean, it's not exactly a question, but it's more something you said, and I'd love to know more. So you mentioned self-complexity, and you said self-complexity is reflected in social network. So it made me thinking, and I'm wondering what you exactly meant, and do you have examples, or can you develop a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So there's like with the advent of social networking and social media, there's been a lot more research into the effects of social media and social networks on the brain. So not necessarily related to that theory, but there are studies. One of the earlier studies that talked about the evolution of the social brain, they found that actually in primates, in apes, the size of the prefrontal cortex in those apes was directly related to the size of their social network. And there's been a lot of studies in humans to try to replicate a similar study, but it's much more difficult to do. But one thing we do know is that there's been some large epidemiological studies that have looked at health, general health, and social networks, and a lot of them tend to show that people who have a wider social network, a more active social network, tend to live longer, tend to have less disease, tend to be happier. Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if that was what you were expecting.
I was wondering actually if it was good or bad. I mean, if it was a good thing or a bad thing in a way. Is it, yeah.
To have more friends, you mean, or to be more socially active? Yeah, that's a really big question actually, because in the world of like Facebook or social media, you can have a lot of friends, but they're not, you might not necessarily be close friends. It would be just people who you're connected with, but you might not have a real social connection with. And so a lot of the studies that have looked at the relationship between kind of well-being and the breadth of people's social networks, one big issue is really how strong the social connection is. So it only really works with people who you feel close with, people that you can actually share, who you feel close enough to share your experiences with, you can kind of confide in, to talk about your emotions, to talk about more personal things. And only then is that really beneficial. I think having a lot of like kind of colleagues or you know, people that you just kind of know, but or acquaintances, that isn't not necessarily something that would be beneficial. Yeah.
I see one question, if we can move on. Let's see, I see one in the chat. Thank you for that question, Natalie. Letitia has one question here. Your thoughts about digital dating or other forms of digital well-being support during these times of the COVID pandemic, such as like counseling or coaching. Your thoughts about how this will evolve in this direction in the future? I hope I got that question right, Letitia. Feel free to.
Sorry, yeah, you got it right. So yeah, we've seen that a lot during COVID, and I was just before in a webinar about online dating because I'm working for this kind of client at the moment. And they were saying that in their studies, they found out that people actually enjoyed online dating videos because they couldn't go to bar, they couldn't meet in real life anymore. So they did a lot of video chat. And same goes for well-being support. There's more and more professional that help people through video chat or this kind of stuff. So how do you think it will affect our brain, or how would it affect us, sorry, if we evolve in this direction? Because it seems that it's more and more happening.
Yeah, that's a great question. This idea of kind of digital therapeutics or digital apps for well-being is becoming such a big issue now, because I guess the benefit of having a digital product and of being able to use it in this current situation, especially for mental health, when mental health is such a big issue right now. There's so many benefits to these kind of digital products. You know, being able to reach a lot more people that might not necessarily reach out to seek help because of stigma or because of just physical, geographical reasons. Maybe people don't have access to healthcare services, or maybe they have a physical disability and they're not able to travel there. Under the current circumstances, like people, especially like people, for example, who were receiving psychological therapy before the pandemic, and then suddenly they're not able to see the therapist. Doing it online is a very feasible alternative. But at the same time, another big issue is, well, can we really replace traditional psychotherapy with a digital alternative like telemedicine? And so far the studies show, and a lot of if you talk to a lot of psychologists as well, who are giving therapy, the answer is really no. You lose a lot of, like, I guess I kind of touched a bit on this idea of losing information in having this kind of interface, and by losing this information, you also lose a lot of the rapport and the connection that you might have with the therapist, which is really, really crucial for the efficacy of psychological therapy. So yeah, there's kind of the good and the bad side of the digital kind of mental health world, and I follow a lot of people who are in that world on LinkedIn, and I feel like there's just been a huge explosion of new startups, especially around Berlin, in the last month or two. And I feel like that this is something that is going to just build more and more momentum, or at least I hope it will, because mental health is going to be more talked about, and so we really need to find a feasible solution, because the current healthcare system is not sufficient to deal with the kind of outcomes of the mental health problems that we're gonna see in the long run. So yeah, I could talk more about that, but I should probably move on to the next question. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great question, thank you. Yeah, let's move on to the next question from Daniela. She asks, can you share a little bit more about your research around oxytocin?
For sure, yeah. So a lot of the research with oxytocin, what we tend to do is we will bring people in the lab, and we would give them a nasal spray of oxytocin, because through a nasal spray it gets to the brain much quicker, and you can give people certain tasks like social decision-making tasks, and we would scan their brains and compare how they might respond in different circumstances with or without additional oxytocin. And yeah, there's been a huge host of new research done in this field in the last 15 years or so. And yeah, there's a tendency for most studies to show that there's, like, whichever aspect of social interaction you look at, whether it be empathy or love or trustworthiness, generosity, all of these different aspects of sociability tend to be kind of, with oxytocin, they tend to move in a positive direction. So oxytocin tends to be kind of pro-social. So encouraging people to be more trustworthy of others, to be more generous. And even for people with, who might suffer from social anxiety or problems with social interaction, there's been a lot of work exploring the potential for using oxytocin as a therapeutic to try to improve people's social functioning, and to reduce people's social anxiety. And it tends to work relatively well, but one issue is that really it doesn't last for that long, and we don't really know what the effects are for long-term use of oxytocin as a therapy. And yeah, you can buy oxytocin online. And yeah, I think there's been one guy who gave a TED talk a few years ago who drew a lot of attention. It's Paul Zak, I think his name is. And he's a psychologist, and he did a lot of work looking at group interactions and how kind of teams work much better together. Like there was one study where he got a football team and got them to play together on and off oxytocin, and found that they at least perceived their integration as a team to be better on oxytocin. I don't know if their game performance was any better, but and yeah, I've also worked a lot with oxytocin in schizophrenia, because people with schizophrenia, they tend to have more kind of fundamental cognitive issues with interpreting social situations. So they have troubles reading emotions, like just more, and also all the whole complexity of social interactions. Some people with schizophrenia find it really difficult to really make sense of, and often might tend to interpret situations more on the negative side, and this can often exacerbate their symptoms, because people with schizophrenia tend to be, or a lot of people with schizophrenia tend to be paranoid, and so this ambiguity in social situations can add to this paranoia, and oxytocin has been shown to help even more improve like low-level kind of social cognitive functions, but that's still a bit unclear. Yeah, and I hope that answers your question. I don't know if you had anything more specific. Feel free to ask again in the chat. I can talk more. Yeah, sorry.
I was just wondering in general, like as a neurotransmitter compared to maybe other transmitters, because I find it quite interesting, and particularly that part of touch, like, okay, you said, oh, you can even like take it, which is quite interesting. Yeah, just found it an interesting.
Interesting studies that showed that it can actually help reduce pain. These studies will bring people in and stick them in an MRI scanner and give them electric shocks. And they would have someone, in one condition, they would have them there alone. And another condition, they would have maybe their partner or a close friend in with them, holding their hand. And just holding hands has been shown to reduce pain and also reduce activity in pain areas in the brain. And this is thought to relate to oxytocin. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking at the time here. Looks like we may have time for 1 or 2 more questions. And looks like Yelena has 2 questions related to oxytocin. Can kindness increase oxytocin naturally? Or what are some other ways that we can naturally boost our oxytocin levels?
Yeah, we can definitely increase naturally. It's been called the hugging hormone. And yeah, just not even, I think not even you don't even need to have physical contact, I think, to boost oxytocin. I think having a positive social interaction can also even boost oxytocin. And yeah, so being, I think maybe like, for example, spending time with a close friend or a loved one could boost your oxytocin more than, say, for example, spending time with a work colleague. And yeah, I think this is also another issue of the pandemic, is that we don't have so many opportunities to boost our oxytocin naturally anymore, because we have this loss of social interaction. So yeah, the kind of beneficial effects that we do usually have that come from oxytocin through our social interactions, we've kind of lost those. So I think that has definitely had a big impact on our mental health. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Now, I think.
Thanks for those questions, everybody. A lot of really good thoughts out there. Yeah, it looks like, are there any other closing thoughts that anybody wants to share? We're coming up on time here, so. Fantastic. Yeah, thanks for all your contributions, everyone. And as we finish up, I'm going to share one small thing with our contact information for the reaction campaign, as Melanie briefly mentioned. Here in Berlin, we are looking to support startups and other similar initiatives, also with a focus on mental health. And I'm going to post the contact information on the chat here. So yes. I'll give it back to you, Melanie.
I was wondering if you say something more about it. Yeah, I'm just wondering, Elliot, do you want to close up, have some final words before we went off? Because I just had in mind again this social entrepreneurship challenge on e-health, if you want to mention this, for instance, or other things.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I'm involved in organizing an event which was supposed to happen this year, but now we've postponed till next year. And it's an event organized every year by a group called Young Leaders for Health. It's a group of young medical doctors who created a network and also these regular events to try to address a particular problem in society. And each year they have this challenge, or the e-health challenge. And this year it was supposed to be on mental health. And so the idea was it would be to bring people together from different backgrounds, entrepreneurs, scientists, people in business, to try to think about potential digital solutions for mental health problems in the world. So now from now till next year, we're going to be generating a lot of new content to promote the event, but the event is now planned to take place around autumn next year, I think around August or September. And yeah, if you're interested, just Google Young Leaders for Health. There's all the information on the website, and we're also open to new members too, if anyone would like to join and help out. It's a really mixed team, really international. I don't know how we have like over a dozen different countries represented. And yeah, it's a really nice team, and everyone's got similar kind of motivations to get involved. So yeah. And yeah, thanks so much everyone for joining today. It was really great to see everyone and have some questions and be able to interact with all of you. And if anyone thinks of any questions afterwards and would please just feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions on the brain and mental health.
Thank you so much, Elliot, and thank you for sharing your insights and taking the time to do this with all of us. And as you see on the chat, I've posted the links that Elliot was just referring to. So feel free to get in touch with Elliot or check out Young Leaders for Health.
In Berlin, right? The event?
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.